I was 18 after all, and as soon as I finished high school, I'd definitely get my own place and get away from that horrible home. Then I thought of Andy, and I realized I had to do everything in my power to get him away from there. Maybe I could raise him on my own. Most of my classes passed by in a blur again. I paid attention as best as I could, but I was so ahead on most subjects that all I did was doodle and write in my notebook. Then, of course, third period came round, and I had to face Mr. Clinton again, Alexander. This time I knew I was still on time, and I couldn't help but smile proudly at him as he sat behind his desk in all his glory. He nodded with a smile, as if finding it amusing that I was so happy I had finally found the classroom on time. Then he frowned, and immediately one of my hands went to my eyes. Were they still a little red from crying? Was that why he was frowning? I decided to ignore it and sat down beside Sarah to talk a little with her before class started. We still had a few minutes. Jennifer waltzed in at the last minute, smiling flirtatiously at Mr. Clinton, and then smirking in satisfaction in my direction. Of course she was happy that I felt miserable. I couldn't care less about being grounded. It was being called a whore, and the fact that my dad had called even my dead mother a whore. I just felt so alone in the world, so unloved. Just to remind myself that at least my mother was watching over me from heaven, I touched the angel wing hanger around my neck. That usually cheered me up a little, but just like last night, it didn't really help. I knew that Andy was very unhappy too. It made everything so much worse. I wanted to see him happy at least, even if I wasn't. I was so lost in thought that I didn't even notice when class finished and people left. I didn't even notice how Sarah had gotten up and left. What shook me from my reverie of dark thoughts was a pair of warm hands as they softly lifted me right out of my chair. Then, before I could protest, I was pressed firmly into a hard chest, a pair of arms wrapping around me tightly. I knew it was Alexander, but it felt so incredibly right to be in his arms that I didn't utter a word. I just leaned in and allowed myself to relax. My skin was warm and tingling, and that feeling in my stomach told me I was falling very rapidly for this young, handsome man. Alexander just held me for a while, his arms holding me close, one of his hands tracing patterns on my back. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, he slowly let go. "Britt," his voice was husky again, "go eat your lunch." I left him in that classroom, seated on the edge of a desk. He was staring ahead of him as if he was lost in thought. I didn't look back as I walked, even though I very badly wanted to go back and curl up in his arms again. Neither Sarah or Bob said a word as I joined them at their table for the last 10 minutes of lunch. I had the feeling they knew what had happened, though. Sarah was smiling again. During all of biology, I stared at the top of my desk. I was afraid to look up at Alexander. I didn't want to see concern or worry reflected in those stormy eyes of his. I didn't want to imagine things that weren't there, and I certainly didn't want to encourage my heart to fall in love even further. It would hurt all the more when reality hit. I couldn't date my teacher. I was one of the first to leave the classroom that day, but he didn't stop me. I could feel his eyes watching me as I left. It felt a little as if I left half of myself behind when I walked out that door. That was just plain silly. I couldn't have fallen that far already. "So I know you're grounded," chirped Sarah when I met her outside school. "What?" "But there's this party on Friday evening. Please tell me you can think of something and come with me." "Fine, I'll try," I muttered. Immediately happy, Sarah jumped up and down and then hugged me tightly. "Awesome sauce." That made Bob snort. "You're so stupid, Sarah." The two of them had reached a black car and they got into it, waving goodbye. Bob was driving, so apparently Alexander had come in his own car. The rest of the day I spent playing with Andy and talking with Sarah on the phone again. It was fun to hear her banter with both her brothers in the background occasionally, although it was mostly with Alexander. I fell asleep that night with Andy by my side again. He didn't like the house. His room gave him nightmares, he told me. The nanny was still not nice, according to him as well. She didn't read the bedtime stories the right way. During the rest of the week, I felt increasingly more worried about Andy. He was complaining about school too. How the kids all hated him and never wanted to play. How the nanny wouldn't let him play with the toys he liked. How Stephanie snapped at him every time she saw him. How he hated all the strange men in the house all the time. Jennifer had luckily not paid too much attention to me. She seemed too busy flirting with Alexander or any of the other jocks to notice me. After her revenge through making my dad mad at me, she seemed content to let things be. Stephanie really didn't seem to know my dad had grounded me, because when I asked her if I could sleep over at Sarah at Friday, she agreed in a heartbeat. That went way easier than I thought it would. Then again, maybe she was just glad to get me out of the house. So on Friday morning, I said with a little twinge at my heartstrings, goodbye to my little brother, promising him that I'd return safe and sound for him the next day. I made the nanny promise to allow him to sleep in my room if that was what he preferred. At school, everything seemed the same as it had the past few days. Although Alexander cast me more looks than usual again, a frown on his forehead as if he was worried about something. Was that because I'd be sleeping over at his house tonight? I was a little worried about that myself. When at long last the final bell rang, I got out of my seat slowly, thinking for once that it didn't matter if I stayed a little longer. After all, I'd probably be driving home with Alexander anyway. Sarah was waiting for me at the door to the classroom and made me skip with her all the way to the flashy red car. I knew it made both Bob and Alexander smile as they watched us, and it was enough to bring a smile to my face as well. Looking forward to tonight? I know I am, the girl enthused happily as she squashed into the back seat with me. The Clinton house was huge. It was more like a mansion, really, built in a somewhat Victorian style. It was pretty, I decided as I followed the siblings into their home. Everything inside was decorated in warm colors, all of it tastefully flowing into each other to make it a pleasant, warm home. I instantly felt at ease. The hallway looked messy with all the shoes and coats scattered about around the coat and shoe rack. There was a wide silver dish on a dark wooden cabinet against the other wall, and Alexander carelessly tossed his keys in it before disappearing deeper into the house. Bob cast Sarah one look, smiled at me, and then said, "If you need anything, I'll be in my room." Then he too darted away up the stairs and out of sight so quickly that I barely saw it. "Come, I'll show you around," Sarah hurriedly said as we took off our shoes and coats. Then she pulled me into the first room on the left, a wide dining room connected to a large, homey-looking kitchen. On the other side of the entrance was a large living room with big, comfy couches and an expensive-looking TV set. How could they afford all this? Alexander was the only one who worked, and it seemed like they didn't have any parents. I had heard Sarah say Alexander was their legal guardian. Maybe they had had a big inheritance or something? Because a teacher salary sure wasn't enough to be able to afford this. After I'd seen all of the ground floor, she took me up the grand stairs and pointed at the doors we passed. That's Bob's room, bathroom, my room. Down the hall is Alexander's room. There's another bathroom, that's the study, and those two doors are both guest rooms. After that dazzling explanation that I was sure to forget, she tugged me into her own room and set about getting the both of us ready for that party. When at long last she was finally done with me, I stared at myself in the floor-length mirror in her room. My auburn hair had been perfectly styled, falling around my shoulders and face in wide curls, dark makeup around my eyes to make them look smoky and sexy, all of it finished off with a little lip gloss. Just enough to make them look moist, almost as if I'd just been kissing. I was wearing a simple black dress she'd lent me. It was way shorter than anything I chose to wear myself, but somehow she'd forced me into it. I still wasn't sure how she'd managed that. It was snug too, showing a little cleavage. The heels she'd somehow shown up with felt strange on my feet. I never wore heels, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to wear them all evening, let alone walk on them properly. No matter how uncomfortable I felt in the clothes, it was all worth it as I followed Sarah down the stairs. Both Alexander and Bob were right there in the hall. I wasn't sure if it was a coincidence or if Sarah had told them to wait there for us so they could see us. Bob's eyes raked over my body appreciatively, his mohawk bobbing as he nodded his head. "You look very nice, Brittany," he said warmly. "And so do you, Sarah." Alexander just stared at me, his eyes following the lines of my body until finally resting on my face, his stormy eyes wide. I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed once, twice. Still, his mouth fell open a third time. Did I really look that pretty? I couldn't imagine him doing that on purpose. He looked a bit like a goldfish. A very handsome goldfish, though. At long last, he snapped out of it. "You're going to that party looking like that?" Oh, that didn't sound very friendly. In fact, he sounded rather angry. "Alex?" Sarah snapped at him, and he took a step back. "Oh, don't take me wrong, you both look stunning." At both his eyes lingered on me, though. "But you know how teenage boys are, they'll be all over you." That's kind of the point, brother," Sarah replied as she pulled me with her out the door. I couldn't help but squeak a little nervously. "It is?" I was looking over my shoulder just so I could see Alexander a little longer. He was clenching his fists at his sides, a frown on his forehead as he stared after us. Was he really worried guys would be all over us? Suddenly I was worried about that too. I didn't need that. Didn't want it. Although maybe it was a good way to find a guy my own age to crush on. I couldn't really call what I was feeling already for Alexander a crush, though. In the car with Sarah, I took a few deep breaths to relax myself. "Sarah?" "Sarah." "Yes, hon?" my bubbly friend replied. "We're not really going there to hook up with guys, are we?" We're just gonna dance and have fun? I hurried to ask her, just to reassure myself. Sarah laughed. Of course. I just said that because I know it would annoy him, that's all. I drew in a relieved breath. Phew, that was one thing less to worry about. Now all I really had to worry about was probably seeing Jennifer at that party. She would definitely rat me out to Stephanie if I did something there that would piss her off. When we reached the house, the party was held and everything was already in full swing. Loud music was pouring out through the brightly lit windows. There were a few people on the front lawn, obviously drunk. The front door was open, so Sarah let us in herself, then confidently pulled me with her through the mass of dancing bodies in the living room. In the kitchen, she handed me a glass and filled it with water from the faucet. Never accept a drink you didn't see being made. Always make sure, know exactly what's in it, okay? Loads of pervs around here, Sarah advised me. After we both drank some water, she pulled me back to the room full of dancing people. We joined the mass. Dancing with Sarah was really funny. We did it for at least an hour straight. Then we only stopped to get something to drink again. I spotted Jennifer on one of the couches, surrounded by guys hanging from her every word.